Uhuru, yeah. I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to salute Chairman Omali Yeshitela, the chair of the Black is Back Coalition, as well as the African People's Socialist Party. I'd like to also salute all the members of the Black is Back Coalition steering committee and member organizations, and also the general members and everyone else that's here. If you are not a member of the Black is Back Coalition, of course, appeals will be made. It's important for you to join this organization of organizations. I also want to salute the previous presentation that we just heard, because that's absolutely crucial when we understand that colonialism as a system is organized to prevent the production of life, labor, and value in our own self-interest, but instead for the interest of the colonizers. We understand why the special oppression of African women has been central to these colonial attacks against our freedom ever since day one. I think about the fact that during the time of colonial slavery, not a single slaveholder, there's only evidence of one white person ever being prosecuted under the colonial courts, of course, for killing an African, and that was a poor white person who killed an African, and the slave owner had him prosecuted basically for a property crime. And there's no evidence ever of African women who suffered a sexual assault to the extent that one person called it the master's right to rape had ever, of course, been prosecuted. But there were African women who were prosecuted and thrown in jail and put to death for resistance to that system. It was people like, there's a lady named Celia, not too far from St. Louis. She was in Missouri, and Celia, a slave, who there's a document called Celia, a Slave, and ever since her early teens, she was sexually assaulted, raped by this a white slave owner. In her early 20s, she eventually killed him, and it was her who was put to death. Because so I think that this sort of underscores the colonial nature. This underscores the way through which the colonial capitalist system is built in opposition to African independence, and shows us what we need to do moving forward. Even though that diverts a little bit away from what I had come here to talk about, I still think it really is important to put out there to understand the true nature of the colonial state and the colonial state attacks. It's not simply about the FBI, right? So I'm President Matsemela, Dr. Matsemela, some people know me as. I'm the international president of the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, an organization to fight for the democratic rights of the African people. But also I'm the chair of the Black Community Control of Police Working Group. Black Community Control of Police is a democratic demand. Is a demand for the democratic rights of African people. It demands the immediate withdrawal of all domestic military occupation forces from Black communities. This democratic demand assumes the ability of African people to mobilize for our own security and to redefine the role of the police so that it no longer functions as an agency opposed on us from the outside. Black Community Control of Police understands that the primary contradiction we face is colonial capitalism. So that's important. The solution we're struggling towards is power placed in the hands of the African community, not nicer, kinder police. So, and this is kind of what we see when it comes to the FBI. Too often people are focused on, we see movies and things like that where people, focus on J. Edgar Hoover, and without a doubt, I mean, the guy probably was a demon. However, that's not the central contradiction. The central contradiction is colonial state power and African oppression. On July 29th, so it's important for us to know that the FBI is one tool of counterinsurgency, and that Black community control of the police is essential in that pushback against colonial state power, colonial state counterinsurgency. A Black community control. So going back to this idea of J. Edgar Hoover, in 2021, that film, Judas and the Black Messiah, had come out, and it was a well-received film. I felt, it described the FBI's efforts to defeat Fred Hampton, who was the chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, by forms of surveillance, infiltration, discrediting, disruption, and assassination. Like I said, I appreciate the widespread of the film because it really sort of brought back Chairman Fred's name and his assassination into the common discourse of Africans coming up. In many ways, I take for granted the fact that, I know about Chairman Fred now being in my early 40s, but people just 10, 20 years below us didn't necessarily know about him. I felt like this was an important conversation we had around Chairman Fred at that time, because it showed him as heroic, a loving man, a person who sought to unite African and other colonized people and even white workers and things like that, who was taken out by the colonial state and a cowardly snitch. However, with talking with Chairman Omali Yeshitela on the Black Power Talks podcast, Chairman leveled some critical contradictions of the film in conversation. Chairman said that the film overlooked Fred Hampton's position as an anti-colonial revolutionary involved in an international movement. Also, the counterinsurgency was reduced to J. Edgar Hoover's fears of race mixing. This was not the core contradiction, right? The core contradiction was the colonial domination of the African community. It is this entire system of colonial capitalism that results from the colonial mode of production that emanates from the domination of African people in our lives. And for me, that is why we must understand the FBI as one tool of counterinsurgency, a tool of counterinsurgency to repress African struggles for freedom that has been central to the genocide that African people have faced for over 600 years. We saw it in all forms of genocide and counterinsurgent tactics, such as sicking dogs on humans, ripping babies out of women, burning people alive, having people drawn and quartered. All this stuff is meant to repress the urge for. We got 2 minutes, right? So to repress the urge for people to live independent, right? It's this that the FBI's origins is with the 1896 National Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and then 1908 the Criminal Identification, and the 1908 Bureau of Investigation. However, and then in the 1930s, if I'm correct, it became the Federal Bureau of Investigation. However, when we look at this sort of idea of sort of counterinsurgency, right, and government surveillance of the actions of colonized people, we have to consider going all the way back to the 1787 Fugitive Slave Act, the 1850 Fugitive 1787 Fugitive Slave Clause, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, the Texas Rangers, and all sorts of other sort of systems created to curtail any struggles for freedom African and other colonized people were pushing for. But also to note that in those previous revolutions, right, regardless of the forms of counterinsurgency used, regardless of how violent, the African people won, right? So this is for us to get organized, to push forward with the democratic demand of African community control of police, but also to importantly know the enemy that we're up against. and it's a historic one. Uhuru.